Welcome everyone. My name is Eleanor Horton and I will be Chair and Moderator for today's webinar for the Community Care Smart Assistive Technology Collaborative. I am a Senior Lecturer in Nursing at the University of the Sunshine Coast, but for today's session I'm representing as an Expert Reference Group member of the Smart Assistive Technology Collaborative, user-centred and experiential approaches to designing smart assistive technology. If you have any questions during the presentation, please put the questions online and we can address them at the end of the webinar. This is part of a series of sessions being facilitated by Community Resourcing for the Community Care Smart Assistive Technology Collaborative. Community Resourcing uses their international expertise and networks to build community capacity through empowerment, knowledge transfer, skills enhancement, research and development projects. Community Resourcing has been funded by the Queensland Government to bring together an online platform for community care service providers who are interested in collaborating on issues and practices related to smart assistive technology. Today's session will be facilitated by Sander van Berlo. Sander completed his bachelor's and master's degree at the Industrial Design faculty at Eindhoven University of Technology. Sander's master's degree project was an e-health ecosystem that combines behavioural measurement with behavioural change methods to support adaptation of healthy lifestyles for cardiovascular patients, specifically reducing sodium intake. Sander established a design studio called Omni, which is developing this concept further in a consortium of 11 European and Taiwanese companies. The project is funded by the European Commission and will take 3 years to complete. Welcome Sander van Berlo to today's webinar.
Thank you, Eleanor. Hello everyone, thanks for joining today. Today I'll be talking about design for smart assistive technology. I will talk a bit about industrial design, the role of a designer and the user-centered design process. And with that I will also explain some examples of methods that can be applied in this user-centered process. First I want to say a little bit more about the design firm Onmi, which I established in the Netherlands. At Onmi we design products, systems and services that focus on building and maintaining health and well-being. Our approach is user-centered, experiential and evidence-based. Onmi means it breathes, thus lives, which embodies our mission to create health solutions that seamlessly integrate into someone's life. We do two separate activities integrated activities at Onmi. We design and consult on products that integrate into behavior change ecosystems, and we do data-driven design and data analytics to support this behavior change. So a bit about industrial design. Product design is the process of creating new products and items from scratch, or working on improvements to existing products. These products can range from electronical appliances, domestic appliances, machinery, to branding and web applications. As a designer, you learn to identify problems and challenges, you learn to select appropriate goals and to realize solutions to tackle these challenges. So really, design is an open-ended problem-solving activity that requires a lot of creativity. And in industrial design, the way that it is also lectured in Eindhoven at the university, we focus on creating highly intelligent systems and products and their related services. So the role of a designer throughout this whole process varies a lot. A designer can be an analyst who discovers and identifies problems to the core of the problem with various methods. We can be a synthesist who can help solve those problems. We can generally understand the range of talents that are required for a solution, so this is more design management. And we can lead and organize a team which together, a multidisciplinary team who together tackle these challenges. And we can also criticize the solutions with analysis methods to establish whether the solution was successful or not. So I want to introduce the iterative user-centered design process. This example shows 6 stages. You could reduce that to 4 or 5 if you were to combine them, but I think it's important to mention these separately to be very clear. So we start with defining the problem. We receive a briefing. This might describe a problem or a challenge, but sometimes this is not defined clear enough. So we have to do research first to really establish what the core of the issue is. Well, we do this through collecting of information. We do research with all the stakeholders and the context and the origin of the problem involved. Several methods can be applied for this. I will be mentioning one a little bit later. Then we start generating ideas. So we do ideation methods such as brainstorms, group brainstorms or individual creative sessions to generate ideas to solve this problem. These can also come from the research phase itself, from analyzing the context and analyzing the information that we gathered. So these 2 steps are very connected and they can interchange. Sometimes when you have done ideation but you're not entirely sure, you could go back to collect more information. And this is actually applicable to the whole process. The steps, it's not a linear process. So you can jump in between, which is something that you naturally learn in a design faculty. Well, then these ideas, which can be, well, they become more detailed. We develop them into models and prototypes to give these concepts more detail and to be able to evaluate them in the next phase. So here we use prototypes that we evaluate with all the stakeholders involved. Again, you can apply several methods to evaluate prototypes and to collect data for the improvement, which is the next phase. So based on the evaluation of one concept, you might establish that there are flaws. Of course, there will be flaws, which can then again be redefined as the next goal of the next iteration. So user-centered design is a broad term. It describes a process in which the end user influences how the design takes shape. There's a wide spectrum of ways that you can involve the user in this process. So it's a broad philosophy and a variety of methods, but the most important element is that the user is involved in one way or another. So this spectrum of user-centered design can range between consulting the user about their needs and involve them at the beginning of a process to really gather information through interviews or through observations. So this would be doing the requirement gathering and usability. Doing the requirement gathering. You can involve them a bit later in the process when you do usability testing. So you might have already come up with ideas and made prototypes and you want to evaluate the quality in context of the user. But on the other end of the spectrum, you can also involve the user at the very beginning to be a co-designer of the solution. And if you use this method, they will have a bigger, deeper impact on the design, as they will be involved as a partner of design rather than an evaluator of the design. It's very important to carefully consider how you involve a user in the design process. Like I said, there's many different methodologies to do this. And you cannot simply approach a person and say, well, this is the problem, what do you want me to create for you? Because often the user does not know either. I mean, if they did, they might not be trained to come up with creative solutions like yourself. So you have to come up with a common language, which can be prototypes, and I will get back to this in a bit later in the next slide. So for this user-centered design method, there are several techniques that you can apply for each stage of the process. In this presentation, I just want to mention a few examples and explain how they apply and how they are useful. Some of them are very research-oriented, and some of them you can also apply in different stages of the design process. But I've tried to put them in such order that they make sense in this example or in this cycle. So the first one I would like to mention is co-constructing stories. This is essentially an interview. This is essentially in the data collection phase, in the information collection. Co-constructing stories is interview methodology that in which participants state that having talked about past experience enables them to be more comfortably talk about the future. So essentially, what we do is two phases. First phase is sensitization. In this, you try to get a better understanding of the daily experiences of a patient. This is achieved by having them reflect on their past experiences. So, for example, you can provide them with a scenario like the image in the slide. This example shows one patient or one person in a social context. This one is a restaurant or a bar. And by showing an example in the sensitization phase, we provide an example with an open-ended scenario. So we might state a sentence with an open ending. So I could say, when I'm out with my friends having lunch, and I leave it open after that. And the user can then relate back to their experience yesterday or a week ago and fill in that sentence based on the example that you give. So you're not asking them to come up with stories from scratch. You're supporting them in the way that they share their experience. Then the second phase of this co-constructing story methodology is elaboration. So after talking about past experiences, we can now start implementing ideas that we might have about how to change that situation. So in this context, this social context, I might introduce a product that measures how much they've been eating. Imagining how that would impact your life just out of the blue could be quite difficult. But if you try to relate that product to your experience yesterday, it might be a more interesting finding that you can come up with. So this phase really aims to derive user needs, to find design opportunities, and to get feedback about the proposed solution. And research has shown that this co-constructing story is a very interesting method, and it really puts people at ease, and it facilitates the collection of these design opportunities. Another way to gather information, to collect information about the context, is to do on-site observations. With on-site observations, you gain first-hand knowledge of the activities, the operations, and processes of the system. Here you see a picture of my colleague from the Netherlands who is doing an on-site observation in the cardiology department of a hospital. The benefit of this method is that you get unbiased information directly taken by the observer. So rather than asking someone else's experience, which is of course biased because everyone experiences situations in a different way, you go and observe it yourself, which gives very different input into the data collection, the information collection. So it's important that an analyst does not jump to conclusions from one visit, one sample of observation, because of course every situation is different and you cannot design based on one instance. And it's less effective for learning about people's perceptions. So you would have to combine this if you were also working with, say you're doing innovation for the cardiologists. You also, of course, need their perception. So you would combine this method of objective analysis with a subjective method. Another way to observe a user to get information about the context is to do individual-centered mapping. Essentially, it means that you follow someone in their daily routine, in their daily activity, without influencing their behavior necessarily. So this example is for a project also surrounding a cardiovascular patient and his wife. We can provide a scenario because we are specifically interested in, for example, a shopping or a cooking ritual. We can say, please cook your scenario, cook your dinner now, and we will just collect the data, or we can follow them throughout the day without even providing any kind of input. So it's a regular daily activity analysis. This can be collected by video recording, note taking, and picture taking, and we can focus the research on specific topics. For example, the interaction between the patient and his wife, or the interaction between the patient and certain products in the house, or the time spent in a location, for example. So really, depending on what kind of information you want to collect, you would also choose the collection methodology. Well, in the next phase, when you start going from research to ideation, one method, you have collected information from lots of different sources. You might have done on-site observations, and you might have mapped someone's day, or you might have done some interviews. It's very challenging to combine all these findings into one new idea, of course, and there are methods for that, such as affinity diagramming. Affinity diagramming is a process used to externalize and cluster observations, which come from different types of research. So you make decisions. This is a good way to make decisions grounded in the data, rather than well, it's a combination of intuition and data, but this really keeps you grounded in the observations that have been done. So you can do contextual clustering, so stories about people, their tasks, and the nature of their problems, or you can be usability clustering. So these could be common issues and problems with the design. So an affinity diagram helps designers capture research-backed insights. The process is as follows. You extract all the information from the interviews and put them on post-its. The post-its are then clustered together in a way that they are common, in a way that they are similar, in the ways that they show affinity, hence the name. And these problems and issues are then shared into clusters, and from the clusters you can start defining design requirements, which you would then work on in the development phase. So the development, we always like to focus on prototyping. Things we conceptualize in our head might seem great, but once you put them onto a more concrete and physical medium, you can quickly see flaws in your design. So a simple prototype, it can be a piece of paper with a sketch, or it can be quite an elaborate prototype, which has electronics and works and interacts, really allows you to resolve issues before you make significant production commitments. They also are a good way to get stakeholders involved early in the process. So you can provide your clients or the user or other stakeholders with a rough preview of what you're going to develop for them. They can provide feedback, and they can help your decision-making process. And it's also a really good medium to create a common language, because an engineer would have different terminology than a designer, or a designer would have different terminology than a cardiologist. So once you can put something into the physical world, everyone can experience it the same way, which is a very good way to elaborate together. A low fidelity prototype, of course, which you see on the left side of the images, this is just a simple print. So there's not really any established shape or any established affordances, but it's just a thought, it's just a concept, an idea. This, of course, doesn't capture any nuances of the finished design, but it already creates input into the design process, because it gives others an opportunity to criticize. Whereas on the right side you see a prototype in the next phase, which is still very low fidelity, but it already has some affordances, it performs measurements and provides feedback. So the range of prototypes and the way that you choose to develop the prototype can vary a lot. But in any stage of the design process, it's extremely valuable to do this. Then, if you have developed these prototypes, either high fidelity or low fidelity, you can do some form of usability testing. So the prototypes are used to evaluate and get insights for improvement. Choosing a method for these usability testing is extremely important. You often also would do a pilot test before you do the actual test to see if there are flaws in your test setup. So very important things to consider in the setup of a usability test are whether you want to do a controlled environment test in which you can really give specific tasks, observe how they are executed, and learn from that, or you can set up a field test in which you provide a more high fidelity prototype, put it in the actual context in someone's house, and let them use it for 2 months. Of course, this happens at different stages of the design process, but also gives very different results. Do you want to collect qualitative or quantitative data? Depending on what stage of the process you are, of course, this changes. Qualitative gives generally more interesting insights into the quality of the design, but quantitative can also be very interesting in the sense that you can, for example, count the amount of bad interaction, or the amount of time that it takes for someone to understand the product. So depending on what kind of outcome you want, you would choose these types of data. Of course, if you want to have scientific results, the number of patients, the number of participants is extremely important. So you would do a calculation if you want to have significant results on, on flaws or on any aspect of the design. So considering the number of patients and the observation method is all very important before you set up a test. So different methodologies can be used to collect this data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. So when you're doing qualitative research, you might use a think aloud methodology. This essentially just means that you let the person evaluate your prototype and mention anything that comes to mind. You could videotape this user test, so you can also later analyze what happened again, because often you are taking notes or you're collecting data in several ways. So this is always a really interesting backup. Interviews can always be used to collect qualitative data. User satisfaction questionnaires are available. And the prototype itself also generates data, of course. So a combination of these is possible and most useful, and it gives you a lot of, the more data you collect, essentially, the more input you get for the next improvement phase. Then on the far side of the spectrum, like I mentioned before, you can include the user early on in the process and really make them as a co-designer. So in participatory design, we try to involve the user in the development of the process, the product, rather than the evaluation. So they become a real co-designer. Here you see an example of what my graduation project, where I was trying to develop a cooking utensil that reduces the amount of sodium used by cardiovascular patients. And I had to consider the way that it presents feedback and the way that it interacts. So what you see here is an actual cardiovascular patient with a large number of very simple prototypes, but each of those prototypes would have different affordances and different actuators. So rather than making this decision myself early on in the process and developing it further, I decided to make very low fidelity prototypes and present these all to the patients so that they would have a say in what my eventual decision would be. So based on this kind of evaluation, I could choose actuators, maybe even come up with actuators that I had not thought of before, or a combination of my own designs. So this man in this project really influenced the way that my project developed. And another reason why it's good to have, well, I think I mentioned it before, to have these prototypes is because there's often differences in the language that we speak, a user and a designer. So sometimes we might not be able to understand what the user means, or sometimes the other way around, the participant might not understand our language. And that's why it really is recommended to use prototypes. So in this example, it's rather simple. It's almost a mock-up, but any kind of prototyping is always extremely valuable. So there's a balance about in these methods. There are advantages and disadvantages. The obvious advantage is that you get a much deeper understanding of the factors that affect the use of technological products. So physiological factors, organizational, social, and ergonomic. By applying user-centered design methods and this approach, you get a much deeper understanding of all these elements and of the quality of your design at a very early stage of the process. And you evaluate and improve in this iterative method. So the involvement of users assures that the product will be suitable for its intended purpose, and it's also suitable for the environment that it's intended for. A disadvantage of user-centered design is that it can be an expensive process. It takes a lot of time to include users, to gather the data, and also to process all this. And these are both financial resources and human resources. So it also takes a lot of time, and it's just an expensive process. Usually the user-centered design teams benefit from including different disciplines. So particularly psychologists and engineers. And the downside of this approach also is that the members of the team have to learn how to communicate effectively and to speak each other's language. So again, it's another example why prototyping is very important. So yeah, just a small summary of user-centered design. The involvement of users assures that the product will be suitable for both the intended use and the context. The major advantage is that you get a deeper understanding of all the factors that affect the quality of the product and the way that it's used. And the role of the designer essentially is to facilitate the task of the user and to make sure that they are able to perform the task with a minimum effort to learn how to use it. And you can really only achieve this if you apply the user-centered design method. Because we are all empathetic and we all try to understand and imagine what it's like to have certain challenges, but really this is very difficult, and there are methods in place and proven to be effective to really have a much higher quality design than you'd be able to achieve without these. So that's the introduction I wanted to give about user-centered design. Like I said, the range of methodologies is very extensive, and of course there are many more than the ones I just mentioned. I hope that you find it interesting and can apply it some time in your own development process.
Thank you, Sander, for a very interesting introduction to user design. Have we got any questions on the website? We have one from Errol from Roma. Sander, he writes, question on access to designers like you. Is there an associates we could link with, or an association?
That's a good question. There are journals and associations where designers publish a lot of work and a lot of research related work. There are often, as what I know, in the Netherlands there are communities, startup communities, where a lot of designers come together and are housed by innovative startup centers in the city. There are always communities of designers, and you can often reach them through universities as well, or through platforms like this.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Annie Branbury. What are the barriers to successfully implementing user-centered design? What have you come across specifically?
That's a good question. I think one barrier if you're doing a big project is the ethical approval that you need before you really can involve users in the process. This is often a very slow process, very difficult. Of course, it's for good reasons, but it's very important to take that into account in the planning because it can be quite a surprise sometimes. Another thing is sometimes you might be a little bit unsure of whether you have collected enough data because, like I mentioned, there are several moments in which you can collect information from many different sources, many different stakeholders, and sometimes it's difficult to stop and to decide that that's enough and to take your conclusions from it and proceed to the next phase, because this is very iterative and like I said, the process is not linear. You can go from collecting information to developing and then back to collecting information. Sometimes it's difficult, and this can be a downfall, to get stuck in one phase a bit too long and to collect too much, because the more information you get, the more you want to do with it as well.
Have we got any other questions online? I'll just check the board. Okay. Can you explain a bit more about how you develop key themes when the data collected at the needs analysis stage is conflicting? That's from Annie Branbury again.
Explain.
So Annie's talking about the method actually collecting the data and identifying the key themes.
Oh, right. The affinity diagramming, I guess. Yeah, so essentially what happens is that you observe the information. So it might be an interview, say an interview. You read through very carefully through all the statements that a patient or well, not a patient, but the user might have made. And essentially every statement about an experience or about a challenge or about a point of interest is written down on a separate post-it. And these are clustered in several rounds of affinity diagramming. So the first round might focus, say we're talking about activity. I want to create a solution that makes people more active. In the interview, they might say things about, well, sometimes I'm too busy with work, or sometimes I just don't have the time. Sometimes the location doesn't allow me, or sometimes the weather doesn't allow me. All these things would be used in the affinity diagram, and we might cluster them the first time really focusing on location issues, and the next time really focusing them on time management issues. And you would do this through a series of making new clusters. So it's not a process that you do once. You keep redefining the clusters and until you find really interesting points to focus on. I hope that answers.
Okay, Anne Livingston thanks us for a great presentation. And have you involved carers in design processes? And she was particularly focusing on the role home-based carers could play in enhancing the design process.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It is always very important to involve all the stakeholders of a system. So it's not just the user that is influenced by the solution we provide. It's also, like you say, the carer. And in a project that we're currently doing, we are focusing on both sides with different methodologies. So, like you see, well, this is actually a carer in a professional, well, in the hospital environment. We can do on-site observations, but the same could be applied for a carer, a home carer, and also through interviews, different kind of interviews. It's very important to collect information from all sources. That's very true.
And one more from Roxanne. Can you give an example of a smart assistive technology product that you've actually used this process with, and how did it go?
Yeah, well, my graduation project was a type of smart assistive technology. I tried to develop, well, it's really a concept, not a product yet, a concept that supports the cardiovascular patients in their cooking, and that teaches them, that supports them in adopting a low sodium diet. And I would say that throughout this process, I involved the user in every stage. So it started with simple conversations and interviews, really getting to know the patient and their struggles. And really based on that, I defined the direction that my project took, because it wasn't defined as a sodium challenge. It was defined as behavior change for cardiovascular patients. So based on their struggles, I was really able to narrow it down. And this concept in the end was aimed to really support the patient in their domestic situation with this cooking process. So really through user-centered design methodologies, I was able to shape my project and also to shape the product itself.
Okay, we hope we've answered your questions, and thank you very much, Sander, for another very informing webinar.
Thank you.